Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
My name is Akhtar Badshah. I'm the Senior Director for Community Affairs, and it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Professor Gurcharan Das, actually not Professor, Mr. Gurcharan Das, who's a visiting fellow at the University of Washington, the Jackson School Center for South Asian Studies, South Asia Center. Let me just give you a little background on the South Asia Center so that you are aware of the work that the center does and how we are able to get scholars and dignitaries such as Mr. Das to come and spend time on campus, conduct their research, and interact with the community. The center is part of the Jackson School. The head of the Jackson School, Professor Anand Yang, was here a couple of months ago to give a talk. It's a continuation of a series of talks that we are trying to do across here on campus, where we collaborate with the University of Washington. We're able to get distinguished faculty and visitors to come out here. The center is essentially focused on South Asia and looks at the development in South Asia, the political, the history, the culture, the science, the arts, the technology. And it is really a place that allows for the understanding of South Asia to grow in a scholarly manner in this country. Professor Keith is out here for Snodgrass from the center. Remind me, there are what, 5 centers here in this country today of South Asia studies? 10.
Almost 10.
So we are, but there were 2 or 3 on the West Coast. 2. So one in California and one out here. This is a significant commitment from the university to establish such a center, and it shows the importance of the subject matter. The reason why I say this is that it only is possible for all of us to benefit from such a center is that if we actively participate in the center and become part of it, attend some of the events that you do, become supporters of the center so that we can continue to access influentials like Mr. Gurcharan Das. We all know that Mr. Das is a prolific author, thinker, entrepreneur, leader of the business community. His work is now being turned into a movie, which Shyam Benegal is producing and directing. He, of course, it's going to be based on his published novel, A Fine Family. But the important thing about the work of Mr. Das is that he is unabashed about India and its contributions and what the future holds for India. His book, India Unbound, is the precursor to The World is Flat. He raises some of the many same points that were raised by Tom Friedman in his book. And he talks about how technology and the creative spirit in India is actually creating a globalization and a global economy. So Das was also the CEO, the former CEO of Procter & Gamble in India, spent a significant career there. Before that, he was the chairman and managing director of Richardson Hindustan Limited. Has participated in major investment strategies, consulted with McKinsey, worked on investments that are happening in the country, and frankly, is also a great thinker. It is our distinct pleasure to have Mr. Das on campus for a short time. We hope that he will come and visit us once again, and we'll be able to spend a little bit more time showing him around campus. But, please join me in welcoming Mr. Das.
Thank you. You do me honor in inviting me here this afternoon. I'm not sure I'm deserving of this honor. This is certainly a very great institution, Microsoft, and it's a privilege to be able to speak to you today. Some of you may have read India Unbound and the very first introduction of the book. I have a little story about Bill Gates, which might interest you. And for those who don't know the story, I believe Bill Gates knows the story. But for those of you who don't know the story, let me quickly begin with that. I took early retirement from the corporate world after having worked for 30 years in 6 countries. And at the age of 50, I decided to become a writer. And at the very first trip, I went back to India, and I was unemployed. And so the editor of one of the leading magazines asked me, would you like to go around the country and tell us how India is changing, especially after the economic reforms? And the very first trip I took, I agreed to do that, and was a trip from Madras, which is now Chennai, to Pondicherry. And on the way, we stopped in the morning to have a cup of good South Indian coffee in a village. And in this village, we were sitting under a tree and there were 4 tables and chairs, and this 14-year-old boy, whose name was Raju, he was serving us and hustling between the tables and answering our questions. And the first thing he told us was that this was his summer job. Now, the idea of a summer job in a village in Tamil Nadu was most impressive. And so I thought something is happening, which I didn't know about. And the second thing he told us about himself was that he worked every day from 8 o'clock till 6 o'clock. And he earned, very proudly, he said, 450 rupees a month. That's about $10. And he said, but that's enough for me to get on my bicycle at 6 o'clock, go to the neighboring village, and take computer lessons, and which also cost 450 rupees. So he had made the perfect deal in life. And then he said that his ambition was one day to run a computer company. So I asked Raju, I said, where did you get this obsession with computers? And he said, looking at me as though I was really pretty stupid, he said, don't you know the richest man in the world? His name is Bill Gates. He thought it was one word, Bill Gates. And he said, that's what I'm going to be. He said, I saw it on TV. And so that's my story of Bill Gates. And certainly I think that Raju was the kind of boy who may well achieve that ambition. Now today, I'm going to talk to you about India mainly, the future of India, which Raju has very nicely sort of started us on. The thing about Raju's story is that it was not, if it had been a one-off story, I would have said, you know, sure, it happens. But as I was doing research for my book and for this article, I discovered that there were dozens of such stories I came across. And therefore, and that's really became the basis of my book, India Unbound. Well, let me then begin with a look at at India's future, and let me though tell you that I find more and more, ever since I quit the corporate world, that the word guru is being associated with my name. And there's an interesting story about how I got my name. I used to be called Ashok Kumar until the age of 3. And my grandmother thought that I had been given that name by my mother because she was secretly in love with the actor Ashok Kumar. And Ashok Kumar, of course, means the Prince of Happiness. And my grandmother did not think this was an appropriate name for her grandson. So she took me to the ashram, to her guru, and she put me at his feet. And she said to the guru, now give him a name. And he's found me down there at the age of 3, and he said, well, he told her, since you've put him at my feet, let's call him Gurcharan Das, which of course means the servant, the humble servant of the feet of the Guru. Guru, Charan means feet, Das means servant. So suddenly, from the Prince of Happiness, I was transformed to the humble servant of the feet of the Guru. Now, I myself, since I was in a corporate world, I had a different opinion of corporate gurus, which is what my name now seems to conjure forth. And that means, to me, good at understanding, but relatively useless. So, I think what I'm going to do is very quickly take you on a tour of the past. And because I think we need to understand the past to really understand the future. And I'm going to tell you the story of 3 numbers. These 3 numbers, which I want you to remember: 1, 3.5, and 6. These 3 numbers really tell the story of the economic history of India of the last 100 years. Which is to say that this is the average annual real economic growth rate of the country. And for the first 50 years of the century, the growth rate, as you can see, was 1%. And between 1950 and 1980, after independence, the growth rate rose to 3.5%. And then after 1980 to today, in fact, it should be up to 2005, it is up to 6%. That's the average growth rate. Now, to put that into perspective, you have to remember that the Industrial Revolution in the West took place at 3% growth rate over 100 years. And that is what transformed the Western economies in the world. Because at 1750, 250 years ago, the standards of living around the world were the same. There was very little difference. The countries which experienced this Industrial Revolution went ahead, and this was the rate of growth during that time. The other perspective I want to give you is that if the growth rate had remained at 3.5%, which was the period between 1950 and 1980, then India's per capita income would reach the current US per capita income by 2250. But after 1980, if you follow that trend, then it will reach it in 2066. And that is a gain of 184 years. It's a gain to die for. And if you took off the backward part of India, which is Bihar, Odisha, Eastern UP, and part of Madhya Pradesh, then you would reach that by 2040. And so you have gained essentially 216 years through something that's happened between just in the last 25 years. And that's really what my story is kind of all about. The next 10 years, or I would say the next 50 years, the story is going to be around 7% if business goes as usual. And if we get aggressive reforms, we might go up to 8. But I don't think in a democracy you'll ever cross these numbers. So what is the lesson? The lesson in part is that we have been reforming in a very slow, painful manner, particularly after 91, but these reforms actually started with Rajiv Gandhi in the 1980s. And even slow reforms add up over time. And I will tell you that some more as we go along, why the 6% is so significant and so very dramatic. Meanwhile, the other thing that's happened in India is that the population has begun to slow down. As you know, the population, as you see this trend line, that it had risen during the colonial period, it was 1%, it rose to 2.2, and in the last decade it has come down to 1.8, and now most demographers are projecting it at 1.5. And this too makes a difference. Also, literacy rate is climbing up, and certainly the rate of growth of literacy from 1990 to 2000 was double the rate at which it grew from 1950 to 1990. So we're on our way, basically, to conquering literacy. This is the big story. The middle class in India was only 8% of the population. It is now about 25% of the population. And this means that this is one of the largest middle classes already in the world. Now, this is not a car-owning middle class like the United States. It's more like a scooter-owning middle class. But the values of that middle class are the same as a car-owning middle class. And you can see the projections, the way I take it, and I'll show you some dramatic numbers in a few minutes about the middle class. The middle class is important because I think in any society, the top 15 to 20% will succeed regardless. The bottom 15 to 20% will fail regardless and will need to be looked after. In successful economies which have experienced the Industrial Revolution, the rest of the people becomes the middle class. And so I would say, and Aristotle said, the best society is the one where the middle class is the preponderant class. And I think that's where India is also moving towards. Meanwhile, people below the poverty line, ever since the growth rate picked up to 6%, 1% of the people have been crossing the poverty line for 20 years. And this is almost 200 million people. So let me come back to that trend that I just presented, that during the colonial period, the GDP growth was 1%. The population growth was also 1%, so the per capita income growth was 1 minus 1. And no wonder we call this a stagnant period of our economy. The British knew how to do many things. But one thing they did not know was how to make a poor country rich. In the post-independence period, you can see the growth rate picked up dramatically, but the population also picked up dramatically. This is what we moaned and groaned, said after all that effort, we only got 1.3% per capita income growth. We called it the Hindu rate of growth, but it would be more appropriate to call this a socialist rate of growth, because it's a socialist economy. Then you can see how this has built up over the next 2 decades and how the per capita income has gone from 3.5 to 4.4, and how, in fact, in the future, I've just added the period 2000-2010, we are projecting a growth rate of 5.5. And that is really what Korea grew at for 30 years. And how the per capita income, you know the power of compound interest here, even half a percentage point is worth years and years, ultimately. Now, this is what I feel is not just the future, but this is what's really going to happen for the next, not just the 1 decade, but the next till 2050. And that's what exactly the Goldman Sachs BRIC report also projects the same thing. Now, why is this happening? And I think there are really 4 reasons for this. One is demographics, a lag effect of reforms, and I'll just take you through each of these things. The demographics basically mean that half the Indian population is really below the age of 25. And therefore, today's workforce, labor force of 400 million people will become 800 million people by 2025. In fact, the table will reverse. China today is 800, and China will become 400. And that's, again, the demographic situation with China. And so that's why they say China's growth rate will slow down. And India's growth rate will stay on, because very largely because the labor force will double. And the labor force doubling means that the dependency ratio, which is the dependence of the old people and the young people, that is babies and old people, on the working force, obviously decreases. And you can see in this table how that dependency changes and how India's picture is going to improve. Similarly, people who are in the workforce save money, and therefore your savings rate rises as your dependency ratio comes down. The other factor, of course, is that the reforms have an effect, a lag effect. And this is what I was earlier alluding to. You can see what happened in China, how the growth rate picked up after the first 10 years. And similarly, how in India, I don't think we'll ever go to 10. But I don't think a democracy can do 10 ever. Even if a democracy can do 8, I think it will be something very, very, very special. In India's case now, essentially we've gone from a period which was a sudden sense of fear by the industry that they would get swamped to a much more confident mindset, where large parts of Indian industry are now much more confident. They've got a global mindset. They're benchmarking with the best in the world. And so these macro reforms have filtered down in the micro economy. You can see also that there's been a divorce between politics and economics in India, that both the major political parties really promise the same thing, and neither delivers what they promise, or delivers it very painfully slowly. But it's the fact of the matter is the biggest stumbling block to economic growth in many, many societies is the politics of the country. And you have a situation where, in the case of China, you have a government which is inducing this miracle. In India, it is despite the government, this miracle or success is occurring. And that's why a lot of Indians say, like the Italians would say, that the government grows the economy grows at night when the government is asleep. And that's what I mean by the divorce of politics and economics. We've had every single party in power. We've had 8 prime ministers since 1980, and nobody has been able to destroy this 6% per year real growth rate for 25 years. So it's sort of as though the economy is on autopilot. The big story, however, I think, which gives me the most confidence, is the fact that there has been a mental revolution. And that's what we started with in this talk, with the story of Raju and Bill Gates. And it's basically the story of my book, India Unbound. And it's very hard to say, but the fact is that the young minds of India became free in the 90s. Whether this was due to reforms, whether this was due to cable TV, but the minds became decolonized. Here we had, I'll just illustrate it to you. One is, of course, I'll just illustrate this to you, this new mindset in our attitude to the English language. Very quietly, without any fanfare, no bugles blowing, English became an Indian language in the 1990s. All that criticism against English just died. And this happened when the Hindiwalas actually came to power. And so the thing, though, about this English that has happened is that it's an English that is an English that's an Indian English that's coming up. The old colonial English, I mean, that's why I say the mind has become decolonized. In fact, all these universities, these courses in American universities called post-colonial studies, they should rethink that, teaching those courses, because India has changed. And the English language, I'll tell you the difference. Now, one of the things about Raju, it was that, before I tell about Raju and English, let me tell you, when I graduated from Harvard, I had done philosophy. I went to visit my grandfather in India. He lived in a town called Ludhiana. And he listened to me. And there I was, 21 years old, showing off my new learning and everything. And after a few minutes, he said, kind of stop it. And he said, not quite Oxbridge. I was devastated. Here I thought I'd been to one of the best universities, and it wasn't good enough for my grandfather because my accent wasn't quite right. You could say rubbish in an Oxbridge accent, and that would be fine. But it had to be a certain... Now that was the symbol of the colonized mind. Now when I asked Raju said he'd figured out the secret of success. And Raju says that he first has to learn Windows, right? Which he's doing. Number 2, Raju says he has to learn 400 words of English. I said, why 400 words? He looked at me again as though he thought I was a dummy. He said, to pass TOEFL. So, you see, that is the decolonized mindset. That the guy English is just a skill. There's no flag flying behind English. And that's why in India today, if you go, you watch cable television, the local channels, they're happily mixing up English words with Hindi words. The other day, the newscaster on Z television said, "Aaj Middle East mein peace ho gayi." That's 3 words of English, 3 words of Hindi. In a sentence, she said it without blinking an eye. And that was the most natural way to speak. Now that's the confidence that I'm talking about. And the difference in this English is that it's not just the language, this mixture. Actually, I shouldn't use Hinglish. I should use English with an I. In fact, you can do a search. I wrote an essay in Outlook magazine with English as an I. And it's my idea, English born in India is because there is Tamil English and there's Bengali English and there's Punjabi English. So we shouldn't say Hinglish. But of course, Hinglish words are predominating. Dil mange more, life photo essay. You know, this is a common way to speak. And this is not just the lower middle class trying to rise up. It is also the fashionable language of the upper middle class. And advertising, you can't be a copywriter without mixing the 2 words up. So this is what I mean is a change that is a very, very important, I think, component of the future and why India is on the roll. This is just an example in one area where reforms have taken place. And you see how the telephones lines have expanded. And the cell phones are growing at the rate of 2 million per month right now. And it's just mirroring exactly what's happened in China, just a few years behind, as the reforms were 10 years behind. This is just maybe 3-4 years behind. There's similarly, I think, a power revolution which is going to happen. Unfortunately, for those of us who live in Delhi, it's painfully slow with which this is happening. But again, as I said, you know, the fact is that the economy is on autopilot, so it's going to happen. The politicians are going to be kicked and dragged into doing it, but it will happen. Similarly, I think in agriculture, we're going to see a second green revolution. And it's going to be, again, technologically led like the first one, which was on hybrid varieties of wheat and rice. And this is going to be as labor intensive as the first one and absorb a lot of the people in the countryside who will not be absorbed by Microsoft and the services tech revolution. But again, we need reforms in agriculture to make that happen. What could be the potential stumbling blocks? One certainly is the fiscal deficit. Second, infrastructure, and third, bad governance. We're continuing to run very high fiscal deficits right throughout, but you know, it hasn't so far stopped the 6% growth. So it's bad behavior because this is government spending, unproductive spending of a very serious kind. But it's when your growth rate is 6, you can take it. Similarly, look at China and India. As I said, China is a state-induced miracle, and the infrastructure is 8 times, spending is 8 times more than India. Bad governance, just look at 2 facts. 1 in 4 members of parliament in India has a criminal record, and 75% of Chinese Politburo are technocrats. But again, this has been going on for 25 years, and it has not stopped the economic success story that is. Still, India is one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Rise of the middle class. I want to come back to that. You see the picture that I'm projecting here really shows you that by 2020, a very large part of India, I would say about 60% of India, it's not 50, but 60%, but of India 50% of the population will be middle class in about 60% of India, which is by a line. If you draw, I don't know how many of you know the map of India, but you draw a line from Kanpur in the north to Madras in the south. You have to cheat a little bit because coastal Andhra is supposed to be west of the line. But otherwise, that line, and the same thing is going to happen east of the line, where it will be just 20 years later. And the reason I show you this is not to get you worked up about inequality. All countries have inequalities, have had inequalities. The US South was very, very poor until the Second World War. And when air conditioning was invented, and suddenly cities in the South, Atlanta, Houston, Dallas, were cities where you could actually go and work, which didn't happen before the Second World War. Similarly, Italy and Spain were very poor. And in India, I think what we have is one important safety valve, and that is the story of India is a story of internal migration, something that's not possible easily in China, because you don't need a passport or a working permit to move. And that's why very large number of people from Bihar, very bright people who are really making their future outside. And 4.5 billion people travel on Indian railways every year. India's population is 1 billion. I'm taking out the commuters. That means the average Indian is taking 4.5 trips in a year on the railways. And that is partly the internal migration story that I was telling you about. The other point here is that you have got some states like Gujarat, which have been growing 10% from 1990. And so you have tigers already in the midst, which are growing very, very rapidly. And then you've got Bihar, which is growing at 1% or 0. The other point about 2020 is that when the middle class crosses 20%, 50%, then the politics of the country will also change. So I don't think we're stuck with this kind of lot of our politicians, who are in our parliament. Most Indians think of them really as jokers, and they don't really pay very much attention to them. And that's where I think they feel that it doesn't matter whether it's Sonia Gandhi or Bajpayee or Lalu Prasad Yadav who's ruling India, because they just haven't been able to make a difference. And there are some other factors, I think, also, which explain this growth rate, and I wanted to give two more reasons. The success of India, much as we'd like to give credit to ourselves, is really a part of a liberal revolution in the world that has taken place, especially after the collapse of communism. And the whole area of it's not just India alone, but 80 countries around the world are doing economic reforms. And it's these economic reforms, more than any other reform, I would say, just linking us up with the global economy has probably been the single most important reform. And for that, really, how am I doing for time? I'm just wondering.
I think you have time.
I have time, all right. The key point is that there is a very old idea in economics, as old as Adam Smith, which says that if a rich country and a poor country are linked together, then the standard of living of the two will converge. This is the famous theorem of convergence. Paul Samuelson, the economist, American economist, won a Nobel Prize proving this in the 20th century. And the question, I suppose, that will be in your minds is, okay, if that's true, why haven't I seen this happen so far? Why have the rich countries and the poor countries not converged? Well, they in fact have converged a lot. Basically, the reason why convergence did not take place in the last 50 years was that the rich and the poor were not linked. That the rich countries, we call that the first world. And the first world was open, and there was free trading in the first world. And standard of living, that's why Italy and Spain rose, because of convergence. The second world, of course, was the communist world, and that was closed. But the third world, there was two economists did a study, Jeffrey Sachs and Andrew Warner, and they studied 80 countries, 77 countries, from 1965 to 1980, 25 years. And they discovered that in these 25 years, only 13 out of 77 countries were open. That is, they were linked. And those 13 countries outgrew the 74 closed countries by 6-1. You can guess where most of those 13 countries were? East Asia, Southeast Asia, because they were linked with the global economy. So the difference between the world then and the world now is that in 1970, only 20% of the world's population lived in open economies. Today, 90% of the world lives. So this is what explains in great part the story, the rise of China and India. That these countries have really taken advantage of their rising on the shoulders of the global economy. And this is not to take credit away from them, but we seem to be living in an age of rationality. And this is perhaps the great, I think the big story of the first half of the 21st century is how India, China, and a lot of the third world is going to conquer poverty. And the poverty is going to global poverty is going to become history. Not the way the do-gooders think it will, but just because that people have got linked with the global economy and the power of the global economy. The second thing that happened in India, of course, was that the world changed. Just as we started reforming, the communism collapsed in 91, India started reforming in 91, the world also changed from a manufacturing to a knowledge economy. And for some reason, which I speculate in my book, could be our Brahminical heritage. And I say I speculate because there's no evidence to it. But the fact is that India is doing well in this knowledge economy because we have always revered knowledge. And whereas we had contempt for manual labor, the Brahminical contempt for manual labor, which prevented us from becoming tinkerers and making an industrial revolution, here, this is a place where we are actually having success. And, for India, which invented the zero and the decimal system, the fact of the matter is that for 3,000 years, we've been working with knowledge that's basically invisible. And just as spiritual space is invisible, so is cyberspace. So it may well be that our core competence is invisible. Anyway, no country rose with all sectors together. If you see the history of the Industrial Revolution in the West, essentially the Industrial Revolution in the West took place with each, say, let's take one country by country. Britain. Britain rose on the exports of textiles in the 19th century. America rose on the back of railways. Germany was also railways. Sweden was timber exports. Denmark was dairy exports. So there was always what economists called a lead sector, a sector for comparative advantage or competitive advantage. I think we've been floundering in India to discover what was that sector, but now I think we've found it. And we found it in this invisible area that I've just spoken to you about. So these are two additional reasons why I feel that we can look forward to a positive future. So, as I said to you, India and China have grown at twice the world rate for 25 years. By 2015, China will cross the American economy, and India will cross the Japanese economy in absolute GDP. The reasons for success, as I've told you, that China is the state, an amazing state which is investing in this amazing way in infrastructure, and India is the market. China has been a one-pointed reformer, and its wealth creators are foreign direct investment and state enterprises. It's a manufacturing-driven success. India is a story of gradual reform. Our wealth creators are entrepreneurs, and it's not manufacturing-driven, it's a services-driven economy. And this perhaps explains why today that India has far more globally competitive companies than China does. I put up some of my favorite names here, but there's another list of 10 more, I'm sure, which you could think about, which could be added to this list. But the point here is these are not service companies alone. They are manufacturing companies. And certainly the automotive component area, like Bharat Forge, is an area, and Ranbaxy in pharmaceuticals. And my favorite airline is Jet Airways. An amazing, I think it's the best airline in the world. And in fact, once it comes to the United States, I think many Americans will just stop traveling in any other airline except Jet Airways. The story really is that India has law and China has order. Therefore, corporate governance is high in India, low in China. By 2010, India will have the world's largest number of English speakers. There's a man called David Crystal, who is the great guru of linguistics in the world. He's edited the Cambridge Encyclopedia of the English language, or is it the Oxford? But maybe it's the Oxford Encyclopedia of the English language. But he says that if at the end of the 19th century British English was the language of the world, and by the 20th century was American English, he thinks that by the 21st century, end of the 21st century, it will be some variant of Indian English. Now, Chinese English will also be there. It will be an English language, which will be a world language. There's no question. And there'll be pickings from all over, because everywhere in the world, it's Franglais and Spanglish, and you know that everywhere. But because of India's economic success and also India's head start with English, he thinks it will be a much bigger English that will be spoken in the world. And he basically says, look, if 200 million people say a word in a certain way, and that's the way Indians pronounce it, that will be the way to pronounce that word for the rest of the world. So that is his theory. I've told you already about the demographic advantage that India has, and that means that its growth rate will continue till 2050. Soft underbelly we've spoken about. India's is infrastructure and fiscal deficit. China's is the financial sector and dissent. So you can choose. Given India's rule of law, democracy, market-driven success, comfort with the English language, being ahead in corporate governance, at least one conclusion that suggests to itself is that China is faster and ahead of India today. But because the success of India is organic, and it comes from below, and from entrepreneurs and the private economy, that maybe it may be a more enduring bet, more enduring success. Now, the path of both of these countries is different. And the one thing I would say in concluding about the Indian path is that the answer to understanding India is that democracy came before capitalism. For the rest of the world, it was the other way around. There's only one other country where democracy came before capitalism, and that is the country we are in right now. There are only two countries, United States and India, where you got your democracy, your democratic institutions soon after your revolution, 1776, and you got your capitalist institutions when the Industrial Revolution came in the early 19th century. India got democracy in 1950, 1947, when we became independent. And there were huge redistribution pressures for the next 30 years. But we really did not become free, economically free, until 1991, when the reforms kicked off. So we really got our capitalism in 1991. And this, I think, means what? This is what explains why the reforms in India are so slow. Because everybody has a voice. No matter what I say, you have the opposite opinion. So India's parliament is like your Congress. I mean, the US Congress is exactly the same kind of chaos in getting bills through, interest groups, and lobbying, and stuff like that. This is not a rational way to go about things in the future. But the nice way is that this is the way, this is the path, which is a negotiated path into the future. And if we can keep going, even if we go at 7 and not at 9, I don't think anybody in India today will trade off a 2% higher growth for democracy. We'll just love to talk too much. And we've just addicted to democracy. And so I don't think, I shouldn't say this, because 2% means 20 years. And for those people who are very poor, the 20 years is a lifetime. So maybe they will trade off. But the people below the poverty line, as I said, have been declining. And they're now down to about 20%. And they'll be keeping going down by 1% a year. But I think in some ways, the slow path of democracy with capitalism is a surer path. And if we can do that, we can also perhaps preserve our way of life, which will be this slower process is a negotiated process that happens. So if we do that, I call India an elephant, so it will be a wise elephant. It's not a tiger. You can't be a democracy and be a tiger. Thank you. So I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. Before we start questions, I'm just going to make some pitch for your forthcoming talk, which is on October 26th at the University of Washington. There's some material out there. And those that came in late, there's also some material on the South Asia Center, which has been kind enough to host Mr. Das and given us the opportunity to hear from him. So thank you very much for a fantastic talk.
There's a sign up for the mailing list.
And there is a sign up for the mailing list. Questions? Yes.
So, in the Economist, they listed the top 20 academies. 17 were American and a few others rest of the world. What do you think it will take for institutions in India to reach the top 20? Although we have a broad base, we have in technology, we have IITs.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a very good question, and certainly I would put the IITs on that list.
Except that it's very technology focused.
Yeah, correct, absolutely. And I've been writing consistently. I write a column in the Times of India on Sundays. Some of you may read that. And in that column, I've been writing about education. And again, it's the problem in India, as I said, is you look at our schools, even the poor now are pulling their kids out of government schools and putting them into private schools. Those private schools charge only $1 to $2 a month, and they still make a profit. And the fact is that we have to depend on ourselves in India. And the long term, I'm sure we will create some institutions. But the fact is that right now, in creating private institutions, the American institutions on that list must be, most of them, private institutions. My guess is that Washington's on the list, and Washington, of course, is a state university, but the state university which has a fair amount of autonomy. And I think that's one of the things, that IITs have a lot of autonomy. And it's difficult, I think as we grow as an economy, we will learn that lesson, how to give autonomy to institutions. And certainly today, this is one of the disgraceful facts, that we do not have great institutions in India. It's interesting, though, that the 4 institutions that we have that Indians admire the most are the same ones, or 3 institutions, are the same ones that Americans admire the most. Can you guess? The Supreme Court is one. The military, the army, is the second one, both Indians and Americans. And the third, I would say, in India would be our Reserve Bank, which would be our Fed. And the fourth one, there's another one that's in common. Besides, anyway, I can't think of it. Okay, let's go to another question.
Without knowing, how is Raju doing now?
Well, that's a very well, I wouldn't be surprised if he were here. I met Raju in '95, and this was a village called Marai Malai Nagar. And few years later, Ford set up its operations in Marai Malai Nagar, in that village. And but it's people like Raju who are making the miracle happen.
So you had mentioned in one of your slides that the rule of law is actually contributing to India's success. Can you explain that? I thought it would be the other way around.
No. You see, we have a lot of laws. Laws doesn't mean you get order out of it. We have an excess of laws, but the laws are not implemented. And there are too many laws, half the laws. In fact, somebody did a survey, Bibek Debroy, when he was in the finance ministry, did a very good survey where he showed that something like 1/3 of the laws of the central government could just go off the books and nothing would happen. And that's about 1,500 laws, and in the state government, something like 30,000 laws are obsolete. So you have a rule of law in which justice is very slow. In fact, where the police is more often than not corrupt in implementing the laws, where the bureaucracy is callous. So governance is a problem. Governance is a problem. Everything is there on the books. But having said that, that rule of law is a real strength of India. You know, that every few months the Supreme Court surprises us by pulling out a law and getting things back on track. When I was running Procter & Gamble, one of the problems that we had in the whole of the East, my company, we made Vicks Vapor Rub. Vicks Vapor Rub had numerous imitators in every country in Asia. But we were the country where we could phone up the police, get a restraining order from the magistrate, and close down the imitator factory, the factory which was trying to rip off our product, within 48 hours. So that's a feature. They couldn't do that in any country in East Asia or Southeast Asia.
I have a query about your question about your statistics about poverty. If you read Sarnath and so on, you get a completely different picture of poverty in India. And to me, it suggests that it's more the way you redefine poverty to make the numbers smaller.
No, it's these numbers. This particular number, that poverty has been going down by 1% per year. This is the poverty line of $1 a day, which is the global poverty line, which the World Bank, IMF, everybody accepts. And everybody, all those people who are also, this is a contentious subject of poverty, but everybody agrees to this number. Whether it's Martin Ravalian, whether it's Suresh Tendulkar, Sundaram, all the scholars agree to this fact that between 1980 and 2000, poverty came down by 20 percentage points. Came down from something like 45% to 25%. So if you project that 1%, that's 1% a year, if you project that from 2000 to 2005, it will come down to about 20%. The people like Sainath and all, I admire the man. They write wonderfully to remind us about the fact that at 20%, that's 200 million people still below the poverty line, which is disgraceful. But nobody remembers, or people forget, people like Sainath and those, poverty is an industry. People in the poverty industry forget that we have also lifted 200 million people above the poverty line in the last 25 years. So you can look at the glass of water that's half full or half empty. Both are correct. Sainath is also right, and I'm also right. It's what you look at. I celebrate the fact that 200 million people have risen over poverty.
How's the foreign debt going to affect the economies of India, China, US, and Japan in the next few years?
How's what?
Foreign debt.
Foreign debt.
Yeah, with the globalization it becomes less significant, I believe. But
yeah, well, I mean, in fact, these countries, India and China, are hugely surplus in dollars. In fact, the problem that India and China and the countries of East Asia have is that they have too much foreign money. They're not in debt. They are in excess. The countries in debt is the United States. What do these countries do? They take their money and they park it in the US banks. So this keeps the American economy afloat. That's why you guys can take loans and everything. So keeps interest rates low.
Is all this good news sort of inevitable? I mean, you're sort of saying all this is going to happen sort of despite all efforts to the contrary. Are there any acts of God or man?
Yeah. What's the downside?
Right.
Well, you know, that's a very good question, and I've thought about that. And frankly, perhaps a world war, perhaps a nuclear war between India and Pakistan, perhaps a war between India and China. I don't know, things like that. But what I'm presenting is the base case. And the negatives are basically factored in. The negatives basically really relate to things like, which I've talked about, demographics, reforms, politics. Politics cannot stop it, and so on. Now, these things you can never predict.
So, one point I would like to contend there is, so there is probably, a thing like war is maybe extreme, but there's a lot of internal domestic problems affecting India that politicians do have to act and they are not. So there is the Naxalite problem, there is terrorism, there is, all kinds of security issues that will transform into economic.
Yeah. The only difference is that they've all been there for the last 25 years, and we've still grown at 6% per year in real terms, year on year.
But aren't they getting worse?
No, in fact, I think in some ways they are better. That some of the areas which were in flames, like the Punjab movement, Khalistan, etc., have died down. I think Naxalites were more powerful in the 80s than they are today. In a large country like India, you will have pockets like that, but I don't think it's getting any worse. If anything, it's better.
The Indian stock market yesterday reached an all-time high again. Do you think this is a bubble, or is it something which is a beginning of a long-term trend? What do you suggest for the individual investors who want to invest in India?
Well, that's a question I'm not going to answer. I've never understood the stock market. In the very best of times, we were growing hugely during the 90s. And the market was dead. And, suddenly it's been going. It's good. People have made a lot of money, a lot of investment. That means economics is a game of confidence. And certainly confidence matters because entrepreneurs invest when they're feeling confident. So there is investment. That means jobs, means growth. So I hope it will continue. But I kind of feel it's a little too hot myself. But my friends tell me the PE is only 16, 15, so maybe it's not too bad.
Good. Sorry, one question, two parts. Right now in India, the revenue collection is pretty small. If you consider the amount of potential revenue the government can collect, it's still underutilized. And then secondly, on intellectual property and royalty and so on, the companies are not getting as much as probably they deserve. On both these fronts, do you see challenges for India in the next 20 years in being competitive or not?
Yeah, you're right. The tax to GDP ratio is 15%. That's too low. Which means partly a lot of people evade taxes, which they should be paying. But partly agricultural income is free of tax completely. But it's the income tax, if you see the income tax ratio, it has actually been rising. It's been growing pretty dramatically, actually, since 91. I think it will keep rising. I think the government, the best thing that's happened is that they have computerized. Now you can actually file a return on the net. And they've made it simple. And they're trying to make the tax department also a little more friendly. It's really like your IRS. It's a very, very frightening department. Nobody wants to deal with the tax person. That's for sure. As far as intellectual property rights, I think we've signed up now, and I think we're part of the game. Yes, sir.
On the conversation of IP, Professor Bhagwati contends that this is a sort of a rich people's way of trying to extract something that is not reasonable in a true globalized world. What's your view on that?
Well, it's a little more complex. The issue really comes a lot. I don't know how much Microsoft, I'm sure Microsoft is also very concerned about this. But the pharmaceutical companies are the ones who give IP a bad name. Because, they've got the government, the US government, to agree to this 21-year period. That's a hell of a long period. Now, they argue that it takes them 8 years to develop a drug. And until it becomes free, they're able to charge really extortionate prices for drugs. I mean, a drug which costs some few cents, you charge for $100 for a pill. I mean, that's too much. It's a complex thing. I mean, it's not an easy one. I don't think Bhagwati, there are arguments in favor of what he says. Maybe via media, you certainly need intellectual property protection. But maybe 21 years is too long. Maybe it's a question of finding a more appropriate sort of protection period.
I realize you don't think that politicians can really hijack this process, but what was your personal take on the last election? Did you actually think that was going to be the outcome that we actually had, or was it a surprise to you too?
Surprised me. Everybody was surprised. It was a shocker. Here was the economy doing so well, and
so are you reading anything into that? Like, are the people trying to tell something to the government, or is it a question of that ratio of 50% of the people getting into the middle class?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I wrote a column about this in my Sunday column, and Tom Friedman actually quoted me in this New York Times article a couple of years, just after the election was over, and he quoted from my piece. And essentially what I said is that in India, elections are the way people express their frustration with their daily life. The fact is that if you are poor and you send your child to a government primary school in a slum area or in a village, the chances of a teacher being present are about 50%. In other words, the research has shown that 1 out of 4 teachers are absent in government primary schools, and 2 out of 4 who are present are not teaching. Doctors is 40% absence of doctors in primary health centers. I mean, this is disgraceful. And that's where I think that really, I mean, that's my next book, really. I'm trying to wrestle with this question of governance. And I think that the BJP, the same thing is going to happen to the Congress. We call it anti-incumbency. No government will survive. That's the law, iron law of Indian politics. No government will be voted back to power. So, what do people do? They express their anger at the fact that when they're having a shower, the water goes off. When you're reading the newspaper, the electricity goes off. You send the child to school, the teacher doesn't show up. These are all government servants who are behaving in this way. That is really the heart of the problem. The problem is governance. And that, I guess, is where, if there's one thing which is a sobering part of this talk, so far it's been all optimistic, but this is the real soft underbelly of India.
One last note, can I just interject? One of the things I noticed is that 10% of India's population is roughly supported by the 4 metros, if that's not inaccurate, right? 33 million in Calcutta, more than Canada's population. And as soon as you get out of the cities, essentially it's an exponential drop of services, right, for people. I don't understand how that will change. I mean, people are still flocking into these magnets. How is it going to happen that we'll have many, many more smaller, maybe even suburban, rural service centers? Like the issue you brought up about primary health. Doctors are not showing up because they're looking for those urban postings. How would that change, you think?
Very good question. Very good question. There's no question that with prosperity, you see, I personally, my conclusion is, and this was my conclusion of India, my book India Unbound, that I think the economy of India is on autopilot. Prosperity of India is on autopilot. We will lift. Poverty will be gone, the kind of degrading poverty we have today. It will be gone. But what will not change? You will have crowding, you will have pollution, you will have, unless some in politics change in a significant way, you will have bad governance.
But I think you answered the question in your talk when you said infrastructure, EPC. Right? The reason people are flocking to the cities is they can't drive 40 miles to get to work. Right. So improving infrastructure has to be the priority thing that we do.
Correct.
Because that would like to spread out manufacturing.
And that's where we can look. I wrote a column a few months ago called Ignore Pakistan and Heed China. You know, we're obsessed with Pakistan. And Pakistan pulls us down into this world of animosities and Hindu-Muslim conflicts and all that, terrorism and all that. Whereas China teaches us about infrastructure, what to do.
Last question, Sanjeev.
More specific question on IP. You know, and because we're all here at Microsoft, it matters to us. And especially of India, you mentioned knowledge economy, IT-based, a huge and continuously growing market. If issue of IP respect and valuation is not taken into factor quickly, isn't there an inbound restriction for the growth of these entrepreneurs who will not be able to tap the vast hundreds of millions of people market in the country? What is happening right now, which is outside.
Say that again, once again.
So there's a lot of IT people in India,
yes.
And India is one of the largest consumer of IT, or should be. Now, if IP is not valued, isn't that opportunity been taken away?
I think that the question of value or not value doesn't matter because we've passed the law. So now it's essentially, it's going to be much harder to pirate things. As I told you, I mean, the story of Vicks Vapor Rub, you just go to the judge and you get a restraining order and you can close you down if you are violating
So are you saying
a law.
you can close down a place where there is software piracy in 48 hours?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You've got to figure, I mean, you've got to get your act together. You've got to be able to prepare, your case and figure out where those pirates are and alert the police as well as, you can do all those things. But you can do it.
We're going to stop because we're going to run out of time. But let me once again thank Mr. Das for a fascinating conversation. And we hope you'll come back again.